The royal kitchen smelled of fire and thyme. Stone walls, dark and damp from years of steam, pressed close around the long wooden counters. Copper pots hung above like silent sentinels. The hearth crackled at the far end of the room, its orange glow the only warmth in a palace that had forgotten how to feel anything at all. And at the centre of it, pressed gently but firmly against the edge of the stone counter, stood Daisy Lambert. She was covered in flour. There was a smear of it along her jaw, a dusting across her collarbone, and a stubborn streak of white across her left cheekbone that she had not noticed because her heart was beating far too loudly to care about anything as small as flour. Because the man in front of her was not a man most people survived being this close to. Alpha King Dylan Bullock was broad-shouldered and battle-hardened, his dark armor still carrying the cold of the evening air from wherever he had come from. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were darker than the stones behind him, and his presence filled the kitchen the way heat fills a room, quietly at first, then completely, until there was no air left that did not belong to him. Outside the kitchen doors, voices rose and fell like a storm fighting with itself. She should be banished. She is a common Omega, a cook. This is absurd. The king has lost his mind. The treaty cannot survive this scandal. Daisy could hear them. Every word, and some small, frightened part of her, the part that remembered what it felt like to be invisible and powerless, wanted to shrink away from him, back into the shadows where people like her had always lived. But she did not shrink. She never did. Dylan studied her face for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Then he leaned in slightly, and his voice dropped to something low and private. A voice meant only for her ears, in a kitchen that still smelled of the stew she had made from almost nothing, or the stew that had changed everything. Your cooking ruined me, Daisy. She felt the warmth of his breath against her skin. Now I want the chef too. The fire crackled behind them. Outside the doors, noble voices kept arguing her fate, and inside the kitchen, the king had already made his choice. 3 moons earlier. Chapter 1. The Baker and the Bread. The outer district of Calvenshire woke before the sun did. That was not a choice. It was a necessity. When you had nothing, you could not afford the luxury of sleeping through the hours when work was possible. And so, in the pale blue dark before dawn, the district stirred. Bakers and labourers and widows and orphans, all of them moving quietly through streets that smelled of old rain and cold stone. Daisy Lambert was always the first light in her window. Her bakery was small. There was no other honest word for it. The sign above the door had been repainted 3 times, each coat thinner than the last, so that the letters now sat atop each other, in layers like an argument no one had resolved. The oven had a crack along its left side that she had patched with river clay and prayer. The counter was worn smooth in the centre from years of kneading, and the floorboards near the door creaked so reliably that she no longer needed to look up to know who had come in. She knew each creak, each person, each story. No, she pulled open the oven before 5 that morning and slid in 2 long loaves of brown bread. They were not beautiful loaves. There was no time for beauty, but they were solid and warm and real, and when they came out an hour later, their crusts crackled in the cool morning air, and the smell that rose from them was enough to make a person feel, just for a moment, that the world was not as hard as it seemed. Little Mabel appeared first, as she always did, or her dark braids half undone from sleep, and her small hands already reaching toward the bread before she was fully through the door. "Not yet," Daisy said, not unkindly. "Let it cool." Mabel climbed onto the stool by the counter and pressed her chin into her hands, watching the bread the way small children watch things they want very badly. Behind her came Poppy, who was 7 and quieter than most children her age, and then Kiana, who was 5 and had not spoken much since her mother left, though she smiled sometimes when the bread was warm enough. These children did not belong to Daisy, but they came to her every morning, and she fed them every morning, and she had long since stopped thinking of them as anything other than hers. She had 2 sacks of flour left, a small jar of rendered fat, a bunch of dried herbs hanging from a nail near the window. Enough for bread today, and perhaps stew tomorrow, and after that, well, after that, she would figure it out. She always did. Pearl McCarthy arrived just as the sun cleared the rooftops. Pearl was Daisy's closest friend, wide-hipped and sharp-tongued, and the kind of woman who could stretch a single pot of broth into a week's worth of meals without anyone noticing the trick of it. She set down her basket at the door, pulled off her shawl, and took one look at Daisy's face. "You didn't sleep," Pearl said. "I slept," Daisy said. "Good for how many hours?" Daisy sliced the bread. Pearl watched her. The tax notice came again, didn't it? It was not a question. Daisy set the knife down on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the wood, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was actually thinking. "Captain Chandler's men are doing rounds this week," she said finally. "They're collecting for the war fund, double the usual rate." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "We can't pay double." "I know." "Daisy." "I know, Pearl." The children ate their bread quietly, watching the 2 women the way children watch adults when they sense something large and invisible pressing in from outside. Daisy straightened up and turned back to her oven and began moving with the focused, deliberate energy of someone who had decided that worry was a thing she would allow herself later, when the bread was done. She fed 7 more people before noon. An old labourer named Westley, who had lost 2 fingers to a mill machine and could no longer grip a tool properly, came in for his usual heel of bread and leftover porridge. Daisy slipped a small piece of hard cheese in with it when he was not watching. He never mentioned it. She never stopped doing it. A young woman named Briella came in with a baby on her hip and coins that she counted 3 times before setting them on the counter. She was short 2 pieces. Daisy looked at the money for exactly 1 second, and then handed her a wrapped loaf and a small pot of berry preserves. "It's enough," Daisy said, before Briella could speak. Briella's eyes went wet. She nodded quickly and left. The afternoon wore on in that way, quiet and hard and warm in the way that things can be warm even when the cold is pressing at the edges of everything. Then the soldiers came. They came on horseback, which was already wrong. Our tax riders in the outer district were usually on foot, because horses meant authority, and authority in Calvinshire's outer ring was a reminder that had a way of turning ugly. 3 of them, in the pale blue and silver colours of the crown, their horses making the street too small. Captain Edward Chandler dismounted at her door. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was the kind of man who did cruel things while believing himself to be doing his duty, which was sometimes worse. He had a thin moustache and careful eyes, and a way of speaking that made everything sound inevitable. "Lambert," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be asked. "We're collecting the autumn levy, early this year, by order of the council." "It's not autumn," Daisy said. "By order of the council," he repeated. He named the amount. Daisy heard it land in the room like a stone dropped into a still pond. "That's double," Pearl said, from behind the counter. The war effort requires—" "The war effort," Daisy said, "has been requiring things from this district for 4 years." She stepped out from behind the counter. "We have sent your king our grain, and our sons, and our silence. I'm telling you plainly, Captain, I don't have what you're asking for." Chandler's expression flickered, not with cruelty, with something closer to discomfort, which he then tucked away behind his duty face. But one of the other soldiers had carried something in from the outer saddlebag, a wrapped parcel that smelled richly of roasted meat and wine sauce. He set it on the counter. "The king sends provisions," Chandler said, "left over from last night's palace feast, as a gesture of goodwill." Daisy looked at the parcel. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a carefully arranged collection of food that clearly came from a world she had never lived in. Paper-thin slices of roasted pheasant, but glazed in something amber and perfect, a small round of saffron bread that had been crimped at the edges with extraordinary care, a tied bundle of herbs arranged more for display than use. She picked up a piece of the pheasant and put it in her mouth. It was exquisite. The flavors were layered and precise, each one performing its purpose without overlapping the others. The seasoning was technically flawless. The texture was exactly what it was supposed to be, and it tasted like nothing. And not nothing in the sense of absence, nothing in the sense of a locked room. Beautiful walls, perfect proportions, and not a single living thing inside. Daisy walked to the oven and spat it into the flames. "Daisy!" Pearl breathed. The soldiers went still. "I don't doubt it cost a great deal," Daisy said, folding the parcel closed and setting it back on the counter. "But food made without hunger doesn't know what hunger is. It can't feed anyone who truly needs feeding. It can fill a mouth, but it cannot fill a person." She looked at Chandler steadily. "Tell the king's kitchen that beautiful food is not the same as good food. And tell the king that if he wants loyalty from his outer districts, he ought to start by understanding what they actually need." Silence. Then, from the doorway behind the soldiers came a voice, quiet, controlled, and carrying the particular texture of someone who was not used to being spoken to that way. "Repeat that." The soldiers turned, because even Pearl turned, and Daisy, who had already said the thing and was not in the habit of being sorry for saying what she meant, turned last. The man in the doorway wore travel armor, dark, unornamented, the kind worn for moving through a kingdom without declaring oneself. There was a cloak over his shoulders, dust on his boots, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had been insulted. It was the expression of a man who had just heard something that surprised him, or King Dylan Bullock in her bakery, covered in road dust, with flour from her counter now drifting through the air between them. Daisy's heart did something complicated, but her chin did not move. Chapter 2. The day the king came hungry. There was a long silence in the bakery. Kiana had stopped moving entirely, her small body very still beside the oven. Mabel was watching from her stool with enormous eyes. Poppy had pressed herself against the wall near the window, or as though she could become part of it if she tried hard enough. Pearl McCarthy had gone the colour of the flour on the counter, but Daisy Lambert had not moved. She had not lowered her eyes. She had not rushed into an apology, which was the expected thing, the smart thing, the only reasonable thing to do when you had just insulted the royal kitchen to the face of the man who owned it. Dylan stepped inside. He was taller than she had realized, or perhaps the bakery simply made everything smaller. He ducked instinctively under the low beam that no one who lived in the outer district ever noticed anymore, which meant he had done it on instinct, the ducking of a man who was used to moving through rooms not built for his size. He walked to the counter. He looked at the parcel she had rewrapped. He looked at the oven where she had discarded the pheasant. He looked at the bread on the cooling rack, simple, brown, unbeautiful, and at the pot of thin stew sitting at the back of the hearth, what made from yesterday's bones and this morning's carrots and whatever else she had been able to pull together. Then he looked at her. "Say it again," he said, not with anger, with something more curious than that. "Food without love is empty," Daisy said. Her voice was steady, which surprised even her. You can prepare it perfectly, and it will still leave you hollow. The people who made that," she gestured to the parcel, "have never been hungry. Not truly. And food that has never known hunger cannot nourish the people who have." Dylan was quiet. His eyes moved over her face, the way people read something they are not sure they understand, but cannot stop reading. "And yours does?" he asked. "Nourishes them. Mine isn't beautiful," she said. "But it means something." He turned and looked at the children. Mabel, who had slowly extended her arm toward the cooling bread again, froze when his gaze landed on her. He studied her for a moment, then looked at the bread, then looked back at Daisy. "What is it?" he said. "The stew. Bone broth, carrots, a little garlic, dried thyme from last summer. Whatever I had. May I?" It was phrased like a question, but the room understood it was not one. Pearl quietly ladled a small cup. The king took it in both hands, bare hands, she noticed, no gloves, and lifted it to his mouth. He drank. No one in the bakery breathed. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Then he lowered the cup and stood very still, looking at nothing in particular, the way people look when something has just passed through them that they were not expecting. "Captain Chandler," he said, without turning around. Chandler straightened. "Sire." "Cancel the early levy for this district." A pause. "Sire, the council has already—" "Cancel it." Another pause, shorter this time, and then, "Yes, sire." Dylan set the cup down on the counter. He looked at Daisy again, like something was happening behind his eyes that she could not name. Some slow, quiet turning, like a door that had been shut a very long time beginning, just barely, to move on its hinge. "What is your name?" he said. "Daisy Lambert." Daisy Lambert. He seemed to be placing the name somewhere. "You said the royal kitchen makes beautiful but lifeless food." "Yes. My head chef has spent 15 years perfecting the art of royal cuisine. I don't doubt it. You believe you can do better." She held his gaze. "I believe I can do differently. Whether that's better depends on what you're hungry for." Something shifted in his expression. It was so brief she almost missed it. A flicker of something raw and unguarded, there and gone so quickly it might have been the firelight. Then it was gone, and he was the king again. "There will be a trial," he said, "in the palace kitchens. You against my head chef, in front of the full court. If the court chooses your food, the bakery is protected from levies for 5 years, and you are appointed royal cook." He paused. "If they choose his, I collect what is owed." The room was silent again. Pearl made a sound that was half breath and half word. Daisy said nothing for a moment. She looked at the bread on the rack. She looked at the children. She looked at the cup he had set back on her counter, still warm from his hands. "When?" she said. 3 days, he said. He turned and ducked under the beam again on his way out, and the soldiers followed him, and the sound of hooves on stone faded into the distance. Pearl turned to Daisy the moment the street was empty. "You said beautiful but lifeless to the king's face," Pearl said. "He asked me to repeat it." Daisy. "He could have had me arrested," Daisy said. "You're pulling a clean cloth over the cooling bread." "He didn't. He wants to know if I'm right." Pearl stared at her. "Are you?" Daisy looked at the empty cup on the counter. "I think he already knows I am," she said quietly. "I think that's why he's worried." Chapter 3. The Trial of Fire. The palace was a different world. Daisy had known this the way she knew things she had never experienced firsthand, through what she had been told, or through the shapes, other people's words, built in her imagination. But imagination was not the same as walking through those enormous stone gates for the first time, her worn leather satchel over one shoulder and Pearl at her side, and feeling the weight of 1,000 years of power pressing down on her from the walls and the ceilings and the floors. The royal kitchens were 2 floors below the main hall, or connected to the rest of the palace by long stone corridors that smelled of herbs and smoke, and the particular kind of controlled effort that comes from cooking at scale every day, without stopping. She had expected them to be impressive. She had not expected them to be so beautiful and so cold at the same time. Copper pots, hung in perfect rows, every one of them the same size, the same distance apart. The knives were arranged by length in a rack on the eastern wall. Or the spice jars were alphabetized. The work tables were polished to a pale gleam. Everything had a place, and everything was in it, and the overall effect was less like a kitchen and more like a very serious building someone had decided to heat. Gerald Maxwell stood at the center of it. He was in his 50s, with the erect posture of a man who had spent decades insisting on his own precision. His chef's coat was immaculate. His expression, when Daisy walked in, they moved through several emotions very quickly: surprise, contempt, and a kind of professional offense that settled on his face like a permanent weather condition. "This is the trial candidate?" he said, to no one in particular and everyone present. An attendant, a quiet young man with an apologetic expression, nodded. Gerald looked at Daisy the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong place. "She's an outer district cook," he said. "She is," Daisy said, or setting her satchel on the table nearest the door. "Pleased to meet you." Gerald's jaw tightened. He turned away and began his preparations. Around him, a full team of kitchen attendants moved in practiced choreography, gathering ingredients that Daisy looked at and tried not to feel intimidated by. Whole pheasants, a brace of duck, a dozen different wine reductions already simmering in small copper pots along the wall. Saffron that probably cost more per ounce than her monthly flour supply. She turned to the kitchen attendant. "I'll need bones," she said. "Leftover roasting bones, if you have them. Marrow bones, if possible." The attendant blinked. "Bones?" "Yes, and carrots. Whatever you have that's a little old, actually. Slightly soft is fine. Onions, garlic, dried thyme and bay leaf. Bread heels if they haven't been thrown out." She looked around the kitchen. "And a good wide pot. The oldest one you have." Gerald, from across the room, let out a breath through his nose that was not quite a laugh. Daisy ignored him. The ingredients arrived. The bones were good ones, thick and richly marbled, the kind that would release into a broth with slow heat what they never would under any other condition. The carrots were just beginning to soften at the tips, which was exactly right. The bread heels were the hardest, most ignored parts of loaves that had been baked for a royal household that would never have noticed them. She began, but there was no ceremony to it, no performance. She cracked the bones across the edge of the pot with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, dropped them in, and covered them with cold water. She set the pot over the lowest heat she could manage. Then she cut her carrots, not decoratively, just roughly, the way her grandmother had always told her, into the pot with the garlic and the dried herbs. Then she waited. She did not hover over the pot as she wiped down her table. She cut thin slices of bread and set them to toast at the edge of the fire. She rolled out a small amount of dough she had brought from her own bakery, pressed with the knuckles of her right hand, the way she always did, and set small rounds to rise near the warmth of the hearth. Around her, Gerald's kitchen was a magnificent storm of controlled activity. Pheasants were roasted, basted, rested, carved. Sauces were reduced in perfect copper pans, strained through fine sieves, adjusted with drops of things that smelled extraordinary. The saffron bread was shaped with the kind of care that a sculptor brings to marble. Tiny towers of food were built on plates by an assistant with tweezers. For reasons that seemed more architectural than culinary, the aromas were spectacular, and still Daisy stirred her broth. The court assembled in the grand hall above them at noon. She had been told there would be 40 nobles in attendance, the several foreign dignitary guests, the royal council, and the king. When the food was carried up, Daisy carried her own pot herself. Gerald noticed. A small muscle near his jaw twitched. She set the pot on the long table beside his perfect plates, and looked at the assembled nobles looking back at her, with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to unconcealed skepticism. She ladled her stew into plain clay bowls. She had asked for those specifically, refusing the gold-rimmed china, and set a piece of toasted bread across the top of each one. Gerald's food was served first, and it was genuinely extraordinary. The court received it with the kind of careful, appreciative murmuring that beautiful things produce in people who appreciate beauty. Comments about the texture, the balance, the remarkable colour of the sauce. Then Daisy's stew was set before them. The smell hit the room first. It was not an elegant smell. It was a deep, slow-built warmth that came from the bottom of the pot, from the marrow of the bones, from the hours of low heat that had pulled out of each ingredient everything it had ever been, and concentrated it into something that no longer needed to announce itself. People stopped talking, not because they were shocked, because they were somewhere else, suddenly, without knowing how they had gotten there. The smell had reached into something old and private in each of them and touched it quietly. What a woman near the center of the table set her spoon down after the first taste and pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. An older lord turned his head slightly, as though listening for something he had not heard in a long time. A young noble, who had been whispering behind his hand to the man beside him since Daisy had walked in, went completely still. At the head of the table, behind the assembled guests, they're standing slightly apart the way he always stood, present and not present at once, Dylan Bullock accepted his bowl. He looked at it for a moment. He lifted the spoon. He tasted it. And something happened in his face that Daisy, watching him from across the room, was not sure she was supposed to see. It was too small for the court to notice. A flicker behind his eyes, a slight change in the set of his jaw. Something tight, something long controlled, loosening by the smallest degree, or the way a fist opens one finger at a time. He set the spoon down slowly. He did not look at her. But she knew he had felt it. Whatever it was, the stew had found in him. She had made food her whole life to reach that exact place in people, and she had just reached it in a king, and the understanding of that sat inside her chest like a coal that had just caught. The court's choice, when it came, was not dramatic. No one shouted. There was no spectacle. The senior council member simply asked, quietly, which food the court found more meaningful, and the room, one by one, turned toward the clay bowls. Gerald Maxwell stood perfectly still through all of it. He was not a petty man, ultimately, but he was a precise one, and having precision declared second to a pot of bone broth and bread heels was not something he knew how to absorb quietly. He collected his knives and left the hall without speaking, which was more dignity than many men would have managed. But the king gave his verdict in 3 words. Lambert is appointed. And then, because the hall was emptying, and the noise of noble conversation had risen to cover anything a person might say privately, Dylan moved along the far side of the table, toward where Daisy was collecting her bowls. He stopped when he was close enough that she had to look up at him. "I came for the stew," he said, quietly. His hand reached out. He brushed a streak of flour from her cheek with his thumb, a touch so brief and light that she could almost have told herself it hadn't happened. Almost. His eyes held hers. "But I might stay for the chef." He moved away before her heartbeat finished its response. Chapter 4. the nights the king stopped sleeping. The palace kitchens became Daisy's world, and she remade them in her own image, the way weather remakes a landscape, gradually and then all at once, and she rearranged the spice shelf by use rather than alphabet. She moved the oldest pot to the front. She kept the fire lower and longer rather than hot and fast, and the kitchen staff, who had spent 15 years navigating the precise habits of Gerald Maxwell, watched her first week of changes with a mixture of professional wariness and private fascination. By the third day, they were doing it her way without being asked. Her assistant in the kitchen was a young boy named Josiah, a 12 years old and quietly earnest, who had been brought from the outer district the previous year as a kitchen help. He was the only one in the palace kitchen who did not look at her like she had appeared from somewhere impossible. He looked at her the way the children in her bakery had, with a trust that had nothing to do with her credentials, and everything to do with the fact that she fed people. She liked him immediately. The nobles remained uncertain about her presence, and the servants oscillated between awkward deference and unconcealed curiosity. What settled faster than she expected was the simple, undeniable fact of the food. By the end of the first week, the kitchen staff had started arriving early. By the second week, the king's advisers were lingering near the dining hall in the evenings in ways that were obviously not coincidental. By the third week, she noticed that certain people in the palace looked different. Not physically, or not exactly, but there was something in their faces at mealtimes that had not been there before. Something released. Some tension in the jaw, some tightness around the eyes that had been constant and unnoticed, and was now, meal by meal, slowly unwinding. She understood this. She had always understood this. Food did not only fill the stomach, it moved in the blood. It touched something inside people that could not be touched any other way. The king came to the kitchens late on a Tuesday night. She was alone, except for Josiah, who had fallen asleep in the corner on a sack of flour, with his head tilted back and his mouth open. The rest of the kitchen staff had gone to bed. Daisy was making a slow-roasted root soup for the following morning, moving quietly around the fire, tasting, adjusting, the way she always worked best, in silence and in her own time. She heard his boots on the stone before she saw him. She did not turn around immediately. She finished adding a pinch of dried rosemary to the pot and gave it one more stir before she looked. Dylan stood at the kitchen entrance, still in his formal clothes from whatever the evening's council meeting had been. His crown was not on his head. She had noticed that about him, that he removed it the moment he was not required to have it, as though it were a thing he wore only under protest. "I wasn't expecting anyone," she said. "I smelled it from the upper corridor," he said. "The soup won't be ready until morning." "I know." He came to stand at the far end of the counter, a respectful distance, and watched her work. "I wasn't hungry." "Then why are you in the kitchen?" A pause. "I don't entirely know." She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the fire. There was something about the honesty of that "I don't entirely know" that she had not expected from a king, and it settled something in the air between them that had been standing on edge. "Or you can sit," she said. "If you want." He sat on the stool at the end of the counter, the same stool Mabel always climbed, a universe away from here, and was quiet for a while, which she found she did not mind. Most people did not know how to be quiet in a kitchen. They filled the silence with words, with observations, with questions. Dylan was quiet the way a fire is quiet, present without demanding, warming the space around him. Eventually he said, "What are you putting in it?" "Parsnips and carrots mainly, a little turnip, bone broth base. I'll add a piece of hard cheese at the end, grated in." It melts into the broth and rounds the whole flavor. It smells like winter, he said, not a complaint. The opposite. That's what it's meant to smell like. She lifted the spoon, blew on it once, and held it toward him across the counter without thinking. He took it. His fingers brushed hers, very briefly. As he accepted the spoon, she turned back to the fire. He tasted the soup, which was not done yet, and set the spoon on the counter. "It's already good," he said. "It'll be better in the morning." "Why?" "Because things need time. You can't push flavor. The longer it sits, the more it becomes what it was trying to be." He was quiet. Then, "Where did you learn to cook?" "My grandmother. She ran a kitchen for a large house in the eastern valleys, and she taught me that food is the only thing that can do two things at once: feed the body and remember something for you." Another silence. A longer one this time. "What does it remember?" he asked, quietly, and something in his voice had changed, a small lowering, the way light changes when the sun goes behind a cloud, not absent, but shifted. Daisy turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire, and his face had the expression of a person who has just asked something they were not planning to ask. She said gently, "What did my stew remember for you, that day in the hall?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My mother," he said finally. "She used to make something similar. Nothing fancy. We weren't—" He stopped. "Before the war, when there was still a house, not a palace." He ran his thumb along the counter's edge. "Why, I didn't know I remembered it until I tasted your food, and it remembered itself." She nodded, slowly. She turned back to the pot. She said nothing more about it, and neither did he, and the kitchen stayed quiet and warm for another hour, and it was the most human she had ever felt inside a palace. He started coming back. Not every night. Every few nights, and then every other night, and eventually with a regularity that the kitchen staff noticed and discreetly did not discuss. He always came late. He always claimed at first not to be hungry. He was always hungry. She taught him one night how to cut an onion properly. He was bad at it. Genuinely bad, with the particular incompetence of a man who had never in his life had to cut his own food, and whose hands were trained for swords and documents rather than knives and vegetables. He held the knife wrong. He pressed too hard. The onion rolled twice and nearly went off the counter. She laughed. She had not meant to, as it came out before she could stop it. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that sounds like something loosening. Dylan stopped and looked at her. There was something on his face that she could only describe as quietly stunned. The way a person looks when they hear a sound they had forgotten they loved. "Sorry," she said, though she was still smiling. "Don't be," he said. He looked back at the onion. "Show me again." She moved to stand beside him and adjusted his grip on the knife, guiding his fingers into the right position. Her hand rested over his for a moment. His fingers were warm. She was close enough to feel the steadiness of him, that particular quality that kings and soldiers carry, a groundedness that had been hammered into the body by years of needing to hold still under pressure. She stepped back. He cut the onion. Slowly. Badly. But better. "Acceptable," she said. "High praise," he said, with the ghost of a smile. What grew between them in those late kitchen nights was not spoken. It was built the way soup is built. Quietly, with heat, one layer on top of the next, and you did not quite realize how rich it had become until you were already in the middle of it. There was the night he asked her about the children from the bakery and she told him about Mabel and Poppy and Kiana, and his face did something attentive and specific, yet the way faces do when they are genuinely listening rather than waiting to respond. There was the night she burned her hand on the edge of the pot, a careless moment, the kind that happens when you are tired and a little distracted. And he crossed the kitchen so quickly she was still pulling her hand back when he reached her. He took her wrist without asking, turned her hand palm up, and exhaled slowly, deliberately, his breath a cool stream across the reddened skin. The pain eased, but she was very still. He lifted his eyes to her face, and she looked back at him, and the distance between them was the length of one decision that neither of them made. Then he turned her hand over, very carefully, and pressed his lips to the back of her wrist, the briefest, softest press of warmth, and straightened up. "Better?" he said. She nodded, because she did not trust her voice. He went back to his side of the counter. Neither of them mentioned it again. But after that, the air between them carried a different weight. Something that had been circling had stopped circling and come to rest, and could no longer honestly pretend to be nothing. It was Pearl who finally said the thing no one in the palace was saying out loud. She had come to visit Daisy on a supply day, when delivery carts arrived in the palace courtyard, and Daisy had an excuse to meet her at the gate. Pearl had looked her over, the way Pearl always looked her over, dealt with the unsparing practicality of a woman who loved her, and said simply and directly, "You've developed feelings for the king." "Pearl." "You burn your hand," Pearl said, "and you let him hold it. And that's not just gratitude on your face right now." Daisy was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It does, though." Pearl's voice was not unkind, but it was honest. "He has a council, Daisy, and the council has a plan, and I don't think you're in it." Daisy knew this, or she had known it, quietly, from the beginning. Knowing it had not stopped the nights from happening, had not stopped the way he moved through the kitchen like he was learning it as a second language, slow and deliberate and quietly determined. Had not stopped the way she could feel him watching her sometimes when she turned toward the fire, and the way he never quite stopped watching when she turned back. Knowing was not the same as immunity. "I know," Daisy said. Pearl looked at her with the particular sadness of someone who can see where a road leads and knows the person on it cannot be warned off it. She did not say anything more. Chapter 5. The Feast of Betrayal. Lady Lydia Hampton arrived at the palace in the 3rd week of autumn. She arrived in a carriage with her family crest on the door, a falcon on a silver field, and with the particular composure of someone who had been told their future and found it agreeable. She was tall, pale, but precisely beautiful, and she moved through the palace with the ease of a woman who had spent her whole life in rooms like these, and fully expected to spend the rest of it in the largest one. She was, the council had made clear, to be considered the front-running candidate for the Queen's position. This was not a secret. It was discussed openly, in council chambers and along the palace corridors and in the servants' quarters, where gossip moved faster than court announcements. But Dylan had said nothing about it either way, which was itself a kind of answer that different people read differently. Daisy heard about Lady Lydia from Josiah, who had heard it from one of the senior kitchen attendants, who had heard it from a woman in the laundry who had pressed the crest linen. She did not ask Dylan about it. She told herself this was because it was not her place. She was a cook. He was a king, but whatever had been building in the kitchen between them in the hours before dawn was one thing. The architecture of his political life was another thing entirely, one she had no part in and no right to question. She focused on the food. A diplomatic treaty feast was scheduled for the 2nd week of Lydia's stay. The attending nobles included Lord Jeremy Cantrell, who represented the eastern provinces, and whose signature on the treaty was essential, and his advisor, Maurice Williamson, who had the specific energy of a man who enjoyed being in rooms where things were decided. Daisy prepared the menu over 3 days. She was proud of it. It was the most ambitious thing she had made since arriving at the palace, not because of its expense or complexity, but because she had designed it to do specific work. Each course was meant to ease tension, to create the particular warmth that opens people up, rather than impressing them shut. She had cooked for a treaty, and she had cooked for peace. The night before the feast, Lydia came to the kitchen. She came alone, which struck Daisy as unusual, and she came quietly, appearing in the doorway with the careful timing of someone who had waited until the kitchen was mostly empty. Josiah was in the back, sorting storage. The other staff were gone. Lydia looked around the kitchen with a bright, assessing gaze. She looked at the preparations for tomorrow's feast, or she looked at the pots and the laid-out ingredients and the carefully written menu in Daisy's handwriting on the board. Then she looked at Daisy. "You've settled in," Lydia said pleasantly. "I have," Daisy said. "Remarkable, really. For someone from the outer district. Still pleasant. The pleasantness of a woman who has learned to say whatever she wants, while sounding as though she is saying nothing at all. The king speaks well of your food. Often. I'm glad he finds it satisfying." Lydia moved slightly along the counter, not touching anything, just observing. He used to visit the kitchen with the previous chef too, of course, regularly. Gerald was quite accomplished. We were all sorry to see him go. Daisy said nothing. "Tomorrow's feast is very important," Lydia said, her tone light, her eyes not light at all. "Lord Cantrell is not an easy man to please. I trust everything will be handled cleanly." "It will be," Daisy said. Lydia smiled. It was a composed, controlled smile. "Of course it will," she said. "You're very capable." She turned and walked toward the door, then stopped once more, without turning around. It would be terrible if anything went wrong, given what's at stake for everyone. She left. Daisy stood in the kitchen for a long moment after she was gone, staring at the prep table. Then she went back to work. The feast was the most successful evening the palace had hosted in years. The court was soft lit and warm. The tables were full. Lord Cantrell, who had arrived with the closed expression of a man prepared for a political performance, had opened through the meal's progression the way Daisy had hoped. A glass of something to ease the first course, a dish to remind him of something comfortable and familiar, a main course that required nothing from him except simple pleasure. He was talking warmly to the King's Council by the third course. By the dessert, he was laughing. Daisy watched from the kitchen doorway, as she always did during feasts. The warmth of success was on her skin. Then Lord Jeremy Cantrell's laughter stopped. It happened very quickly. He reached for his water glass, and the glass made it halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down heavily and made a sound that was not a word. The man beside him turned. Cantrell's face had gone the particular grey-white of something wrong, and then he pitched forward, and chaos broke the room open like an egg on a stone floor. People stood. People shouted. Someone called for the physicians. Cantrell was lowered from his chair to the floor, his body rigid and trembling, foam at the corners of his mouth. The word that rose fastest from the crowd was one word: poison. And the second word to follow it, moving through the room with a speed that turned Daisy's blood cold, was her own name. The dish had come from her kitchen. She was in the doorway when the guards reached her, and she did not run because she had nothing to run from, and they took her by both arms, and she held herself still and straight and looked at the room. And across the room, through the chaos and the noise and the overturned chairs, she found Dylan's face. He was looking back at her. His expression was complicated, complex and layered and controlled in the way that meant he was working very hard to hold himself together in front of 100 people. "Take her to the holding room," he said, quietly to the guard. Not, "Let her go." Not, "She wouldn't." Take her to the holding room. She was not hurt. No one was rough with her. But the door of the holding room closed behind her, and she sat in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the palace rearranging itself around a crisis, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before the bakery, the sick, cold certainty of being completely alone and completely powerless. He came to her before midnight. He came alone, without guards, which was the only indication that he was there as himself, rather than as the king. He sat down across from her at the small table in the holding room and looked at her in the low lamplight. "I believe you," he said. She looked back at him. Her expression didn't change. "Then let me go." "Cantrell is alive," he said. "The physicians reached him in time. But he is injured, and he is furious, and his signature on that treaty is now in serious doubt." He folded his hands on the table. "If I release you tonight, and the council sees it as partiality, you're asking me to stay," she said. "I'm asking for time." "To do what?" Her voice was quiet, but it was not soft. "To find proof? While I sit here accused? While the outer district wonders what happened to the baker who went to the palace and apparently poisoned a lord? Daisy, you said you believe me. I do. Then that should be enough." Her voice broke, just slightly, on the last word. Not with crying, but with the particular fracture of someone who has expected something and found the expectation too expensive to maintain. He sat very still across from her. She looked at the door. "I need you to do what is necessary," she said. "Oh, I understand what that means. I understand that you have a treaty and a kingdom and a council to answer to." She looked back at him. "But I need you to understand that I came to your palace in good faith, and I cooked in your kitchen in good faith. And whatever happened to that man tonight, I did not do it." "I know," he said. "Then do what you have to do," she said. "But don't tell me it's for my protection. It isn't. It's for the treaty." He did not argue with that. He left. 3 days later, under council pressure and with the treaty still unsigned, she was quietly released from the holding room and escorted to the palace gate with her satchel and her worn coat and the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that she will not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She walked home through the outer district in the early morning. She pushed open the cracked door of her bakery, sat down at the counter, and pressed her hands flat against the worn wood, where she did not cry. She heated the oven. Chapter 6. The Truth, the Crown. Tried to hide the palace was quieter without her, and it knew it. This was not a metaphor. Kitchens have a particular kind of knowledge, a sensory memory, and the royal kitchen remembered what it had been before Daisy, and went back to being that. Technically correct, perfectly managed, and missing something it could not name. The food was fine. It tasted like fine. Dylan ate at his own table in silence for 4 days without commenting on it, and on the 5th day pushed his plate aside after 2 bites and went to stand by the window of his study, looking out at the kingdom that was his responsibility and his inheritance and his cage, and felt in his chest an absence that he had been trying to argue himself out of since the moment he had said, "Take her to the holding room," and watched the guards walk her away. He had told himself it was the right choice. He had told himself it was political necessity, strategic calculation, the weight of 1,000 considerations balanced against one. He had told himself that what he felt when she looked at him was manageable, containable, a thing that could be set aside in the way that kings set aside personal things for the larger good. He had been telling himself this for 5 days. He was not persuaded. On the 6th morning, Josiah knocked at his study door, and Josiah was small for his age, and tended to speak in the low, careful way of children who have learned that adults take them more seriously when they are not enthusiastic. He stood in the doorway with both hands pressed together in front of him, and his face carrying the look of someone who had been sitting on something heavy. "Sire," he said. Dillon turned from the window. "What is it?" "I have something to tell you," Josiah said. "About the feast." He told it simply and directly, or in the way of someone who has rehearsed the telling because they were frightened. Lady Lydia, 3 nights before the feast, had given him a small glass vial. She had told him it was a flavor enhancer for the soup. A salt extract from the northern coast, she had said, something the eastern nobles enjoyed. She had given it to him privately, in the corridor outside the kitchen, and told him to add it to the Lord's portion of the main soup course. He had done it. Now he was 12, and she was a lady, and he had not known what else to do. He had not connected what he had done to Lord Cantrell until Daisy was taken away. And he had been too frightened to speak until now. He pressed the empty vial into Dillon's hand with both of his. The glass was dark blue, the size of a thumb, and when Dillon held it to the light, he could see a faint residue of something pale along the interior. He called the royal apothecary within the hour. The apothecary, Declara Williamson, a precise woman with ink-stained fingers who spoke with the considered tone of someone who understood that her words carried weight in proportion to their accuracy, examined the vial, ran her tests, and presented her findings in Dillon's council chamber before the day was out. The substance was a nerve compound, she said, rare, derived from a specific plant found only in the coastal provinces. In small doses it was incapacitating. In larger doses it was fatal. What Lord Cantrell had received was a measured dose, enough to cause a dramatic collapse, enough to cause reasonable doubt, not quite enough to kill. The dosing, she said, was deliberate. Dillon sat with this information for a long time after the council chamber emptied. The council had advised him, when Clara finished speaking, and the implications were visible in every face in the room, to handle this quietly. No public accusations. The treaty was still not signed. Ne Lydia's family held significant provincial influence. A scandal would benefit no one, and the woman could simply be removed quietly from consideration and sent home. She framed an innocent person, Dillon said. The outer district cook has returned home, one council member said carefully. She is unharmed. Dillon looked at him. She was arrested in front of 40 people and imprisoned and removed from her position in front of everyone who knew her. And you're telling me she is unharmed? The silence that followed had the quality of a room full of people suddenly becoming very aware of which direction the door was in. I will handle this, Dillon said. Publicly. He sent a rider to the outer district. Lady Lydia Hampton had been living in the palace in the pleasant suspended state of someone waiting for an outcome they expected to be favourable. She received the summons to the main hall with the composure of a woman who had no reason to believe the hall was anything other than an opportunity. The entire court was assembled when she arrived. Dillon stood at the front of the hall, and he was not wearing his crown. He had not worn it deliberately. He was still in his working clothes, the plain dark ones he wore for early mornings and late nights, the ones he wore when he was being himself, rather than a symbol. This detail, too small as it seemed, registered in the room, with the instinctive awareness that courts develop for what it means when a king shows up, undressed for ceremony. He laid out the evidence methodically, Josiah's testimony, delivered in the young boy's careful voice to the silent hall. Clara's findings, presented by the apothecary herself with her characteristic precision. The vial, placed on the council table so everyone present could see it. The chain of sequence, both from the corridor to the kitchen, to the bowl to Lord Cantrell's chair, described without embellishment or drama. Lydia's composure was extraordinary. For most of it she held her expression with genuine control, a faint frown, an air of polite attentiveness, nothing that could be read as confirmation or denial. It was only when Josiah described the meeting in the corridor, the specific words she had used, the specific instructions, that something shifted in her face. Not guilt, exactly, but calculation, a rapid recalculating of odds. Then she looked at Dylan, and he looked back at her, and whatever she saw there ended the calculation. "The boy is mistaken," she said. "He is not," Dylan said. "He is a kitchen child with no standing." "The apothecary confirmed the compound in the vial," Dylan said. "A vial with your household's residue on the exterior. The apothecary traced the compound's origin to a supplier in your family's coastal province." He was very calm, or the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has made a decision they are fully committed to. "You administered a nerve compound to an innocent woman's kitchen through a frightened child who trusted an adult's authority to frame her and remove her from this palace." The room was entirely silent. "And because of what you did," he said, "she was arrested and imprisoned and exiled. As a woman who had done nothing except cook food that was honest and warm and, for reasons that are not your concern, mattered to me." Lydia said nothing. "You are banished from Calvenshire," Dylan said. "Your family's trading contracts with the Crown are dissolved. Your household will be escorted to the border." He turned to the council. "This is not a negotiation." The sound in the room after that was the sound of a court recalibrating, the subtle, to collective shift of understanding that this king, whom many of them had spent years reading as controllable, navigable, manageable, was something different than they had estimated. Then he turned to the guard at the side door. "Bring her in," he said. Chapter 7. The king who knelt. Daisy had been in her bakery for 2 weeks when the king's rider came. She had spent those 2 weeks the way she always spent hard things, by doing the only work she knew how to do, or she had fed Mabel and Poppy and Kiana every morning. She had made bread for Westley, and soup for Briella and her baby, and whatever else was needed, in whatever way she could manage it. She had not talked about what happened at the palace, because, what was there to say, really? I cooked for a king and got thrown in a room and sent home. That was a sentence she already knew the shape of without needing to say it out loud. Pearl had not pressed her. Pearl had come and cooked beside her, and kept her company without performing sympathy, which was exactly the right thing, and which Pearl had always known. The rider who appeared at the bakery door was not in full royal livery. He was in the plain travelling clothes of a palace messenger, and he carried a sealed note, and the seal on the note was Dylan's personal mark rather than the official crown seal, which was either a detail she was reading too much into or a detail that meant something. Or the note said, in a handwriting she did not know, but suspected, was his. 3 words. Come to court. No explanation. No formal summons language. No, by order of the Crown. Just 3 words, and the particular uncertainty of whether 3 words were a request or a command or something in between that did not yet have a name. She looked at the note for a long time. Then she folded it and put it on her apron pocket and told Pearl she would be back. She did not dress differently. She wore what she always wore, her good apron over her everyday dress, her hair pulled back the way she pinned it for work. She walked to the palace the way she walked to market, without hurrying, letting herself feel the cobblestones under her feet and the morning air on her face, because these were real things, and she wanted to be rooted in real things when she walked back into the place that had hurt her. The guard at the gate let her through without announcement, for the corridor inside was quieter than she remembered. She was brought to the main hall. The doors were open. The hall was full, Nobles and council members and staff and foreign guests, and people she recognized and people she didn't, all standing along the sides of the room, the way people stand when they know something is about to happen and are trying to have the best possible position to see it. At the front of the hall stood Dylan. He was not wearing his crown. She noticed this the moment she entered, the way you notice the absence of something that has always been there, like walking into a room with a window where there used to be a wall. Without it, his face was different. More itself. He looked at her as she walked down the center of the hall. The room was very quiet. She kept her chin level and her pace steady and her expression composed, or because she had learned a long time ago that composure was the only thing that truly belonged to her in every situation, and she was not giving it away. She stopped in front of him. "You asked for me," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Around them the court was so still that the fire at the end of the hall was audible, a small, living sound in a room full of held breath. Then Dylan stepped forward, down from the dais, to off the raised platform where the throne sat and where kings stood to address their courts from above. He stepped down to the floor, and then he went further. He bent his knee. He knelt on the stone floor of the main hall in front of the assembled court of Calvenshire, in his plain working clothes without his crown, and he took Daisy Lambert's hand in both of his. The sound that went through the room was not a sound anyone had planned. It was involuntary and collective, though the breath of 40 people all doing the same thing at once. Someone near the back whispered something and was immediately silenced by the person beside them. Dylan looked up at her. "Lady Lydia's crime has been proven, and she has been banished," he said. "The court knows what happened, and the court knows now that you were innocent of everything you were accused of, and that your imprisonment was unjust, and that this palace owes you an apology that I am not sure it is capable of giving adequately." Daisy looked at him, at his face, turned up toward hers, at his hands holding hers, at the particular expression on him that was not the expression of a king performing something calculated, but of a man who was in the middle of something he was genuinely uncertain about the outcome of. "I had a choice," he said, more quietly, "between my kingdom and you. I chose my kingdom, and I told myself it was the right choice, the only choice, that a king does not have the luxury of choosing a person over the weight of a crown." A pause. "I spent 2 weeks trying to believe that," he said. "I couldn't." She was looking at him steadily, and whatever was happening in her chest she was not yet allowing onto her face. "The council wanted me to handle this quietly," he said. "They wanted me to remove Lydia without public scandal, let the treaty proceed, let you return to your bakery, and be—" He stopped. "Be forgotten? As though that were an acceptable thing to ask of either of us." He shifted slightly on the stone. "I am not asking this as a king," he said. "I am asking it as a man who should have defended you when he had the chance, and did not, who should not have let you walk out of this palace, believing I chose a treaty over your worth, and who would like very much to spend the rest of however long I have proving to you that I understand the difference between the two." Silence. Her thumb moved, very slightly, against his hand. "You still owe me help chopping onions," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a forgiveness in the form of a speech. It was a small, quiet, warm thing. The same kind of thing she had always offered. Not grand and not performing. Just real. The sound that came from the court was unexpected. It broke the tension the way a cracked egg breaks, cleanly, releasing something that had been held too tight. There was laughter, and there was the particular sound of collective relief, and somewhere near the back, a woman Daisy did not know started clapping, and then immediately tried to stop, and then didn't stop. Dylan rose from the stone. He was taller than her, standing. He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who has let himself want something, and is still slightly amazed to find it within reach. "The kitchen," he said. "Tonight?" She tilted her head slightly. "Bring the good knife. The one from the eastern wall rack. I know which one. You've been using the wrong one." "I know," he said. "I was using any excuse." She looked at him. He looked at her. And the court of Calventia, watching, and understood in that moment that whatever they had witnessed was not a political maneuver and not a performance, and not any of the careful, calculated things that courts were built to produce. It was simply two people in a room full of witnesses being honest with each other. The treaty with Lord Cantrell was signed the following week. Cantrell, having received a full account of the evening's events and a formal apology from the Crown, they had returned to the table with the good grace of a man who respected directness, and the negotiations concluded without incident. The council adjusted. Councils always did. Epilogue. The King's Hearth. The bakery in the outer district of Calvenshire got a new sign that winter. The King's Hearth, painted in clean, dark letters by a craftsman who came out from the Palace district with Daisy's exact specifications and spent an afternoon making it right. The lettering sat level and clear, and the wood was good. It would last through the rain. Mabel was the first one to read it out loud. She stood on the pavement in front of it, with her head tipped back, and sounded out each letter with the precise, triumphant effort of a child who is proud of her reading. And when she finished, she looked at Daisy and said, very seriously, "Is the king coming here?" "Sometimes," Daisy said. Mabel considered this. "Does he eat the brown bread?" "He does." Mabel nodded, satisfied, and went inside. For the king came on a Thursday. He came on foot, without escort, in the same plain travelling clothes he wore when he did not want to be a symbol, and he ducked under the low beam by the door without having to think about it, and sat on the stool at the end of the counter, as though he had always sat there. Daisy set a pot on the hearth. Bones, carrots, dried thyme, the same as always. "You brought the knife," she said. He produced it from his coat. "That's the eastern wall knife," she said. "Ah, yes. You've been practicing." He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in the way it always moved when he was fighting a smile and winning only barely. She handed him an onion. He cut it. Slowly. Badly, but better than he had before, and with the careful attention of a man who was doing an ordinary task as though it were the most important thing in the world. Because it was, or near enough. The kitchen filled with the smell of broth and thyme. The fire crackled in the hearth, but outside the outer district was doing its evening things, carts on stone, voices in doorways, children being called in from the cold. Daisy tasted the broth, added a pinch of salt, tasted again. "Tell me something," Dylan said after a while. "What?" "When you first made this for me, in the bakery. Did you know?" She looked at the pot. "Know what?" "That it would do what it did." She thought about it honestly, which she always did. "I knew it would do something," she said. "It always does something. That's the whole point of it." She gave the pot one more slow stir. "But I didn't know it would do that." He was quiet for a moment. "What did it do?" She looked at him across the counter. "It made you remember," she said, "that you were a person before you were a king." She paused. "And that you could be one again." The fire settled in the hearth. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the palace kitchen, in the flour-dusted dark, with his hand cool against her burned wrist, with something unguarded and completely undeniable. You fed my kingdom, he said, and then you fed me. You helped chop onions, she said. Badly. Getting better. He smiled then, fully, not the ghost of a smile or the corner of one, but a real, unguarded smile that was the exact expression of a man who has put down something very heavy and discovered that his hands are free. Daisy turned back to the fire. She was smiling too, though she kept it to herself, because some things are better kept close, like good broth over low heat, and the slow warmth that builds in a room between two people who have chosen each other, not grandly, not with ceremony, but with the small and daily and inexhaustible act of showing up. The pot simmered. The bread rose. And outside the window, the outer district of Kelvinshire carried on in the way it had always carried on. A little worn, a little warm, and fed by the stubborn love of a woman who understood that hunger was not only a thing of the body, and that the most powerful thing you could put in front of another person was a bowl of something real. The king's hearth was known, in later years, for two things: the bread, which people travelled from the inner city to taste, and the evenings, once or twice a week, when a tall man with no crown was seen at the side counter, badly chopping vegetables, while the woman at the fire laughed and did not apologize for it. Thank you for watching Daisy and Dylan's story here on Ariel Romance Library, where love rises like bread in the oven, where kings fall harder than kingdoms, and where the most powerful magic in the world might simply be a warm meal shared with the right person. Stories where warmth is not weakness, where hunger, the real kind, the deep kind, always finds its way home. Where in the world are you watching from tonight?